The first ever recorded death related to hazing took place in 1954 when Gonzalo Mariano Albert died of a burst appendix following a hazing initiation. Gonzalo wanted to be part of the Upsilon Sigma Phi fraternity, a fraternity within the University of the Philippines, Diliman. 37 years later, in 1991, Leonardo Villa died of another hazing perpetrated by members of the Aquila Legis fraternity of the Ateneo de Manila University Law School. 4 years later, the Anti-Hazing Act of 1995 was passed. In a nutshell, and perhaps unsurprisingly, this law prohibited and penalized harm and violence within fraternities and sororities. The only problem is the law's wording and its effect were very much lacking. Perhaps as a result, therefore, every year since the law's enactment, there have been hazing-related deaths and only one person was successfully convicted under the 1995 law so far. This was in 2017 when two defendants in the Marlon Villanueva case were found guilty of the young man's death. Villanueva was a student of UP Los Baños and was being initiated into the Alpha Phi Omega fraternity when he died of injuries from hazing. In recent times, the Filipino hazing problem has yet again been raised in discussions following several high-profile cases. These were the deaths of people who are not necessarily famous and or rich, but the power of social media, especially TikTok, and the reach of Facebook and YouTube has placed more eyes on the issue, making them of national interest. The commonly recurring questions asked are mostly along the lines of, why is hazing still happening? Why do fraternities exist? Why is the law not working? I will not try to offer any academic answer to these questions in this episode, but instead, I would like to highlight two lives who were brutally cut short because of hazing, whilst also share my thoughts on the matter in general. I know that I have listeners who may be fraternity or sorority members, so I want to ask you to keep an open mind. This is the case of Atio Castillo. Mabuhay Lagim fam, welcome to another episode of Lagim, a Filipino true crime podcast. This is episode 7 of season 4. If you are new here, welcome to the Lagim fam. If you end up liking this episode and podcast, make sure to follow, rate, and review me on the podcast platform you are using to listen to my episodes. Make sure to also follow me on social media. I've included links to all my social media accounts in the show notes, so make sure to check those out. If you have been on this true crime podcast ride with me for some time now, welcome back. As always, if you want to support the podcast, you are welcome to make donations through buymecoffee.com. That link is also in the show notes. Please note that in this episode, I will mainly be covering Atio's case with a short coverage of Matmat Salilig's case as well, so please listen until the very end. As always, details in this case might be triggering for some people, so please take care of yourself whilst listening. A few days before my birthday in 2017, I found myself yet again on Twitter perusing the many streams of consciousness from various people who I follow on that platform. But on that day, I did not necessarily find many snarky movie reviews or complaints about certain government services. Instead, my feed was full of a picture of a young man with a contagious smile and a youthful glow. Who is this guy, I thought. I first did not pay attention to the captions or tweets that went along with the picture, but then one tweet had the word hazing written in all caps underneath the image of the smiling youth, and I caught myself saying, not again. That was my introduction to Horacio Castillo III, fondly known to family and friends as Atio. Instantly, I knew I had to read up more on the case because I grew up in the 90s when there were hazing-related deaths or hazing controversies being reported left and right almost every day. Some of the young men died, some sustained irreparable physical injuries, and some were left unscathed. As a child, I never understood the point of it all, even though my mother tried to explain it to me, seeing as she was part of a sorority when she was in college. Even as an adult, the rationale of hazing initiations still escapes me, but then again, I've never been part of any sorority. But enough about me. Back to Atio for now. Atio Castillo was born on the 26th of May, 1995. He was the third of his name in his extended family, so instead of being called Horacio, he was simply known as Atio. When Atio was born, Father Horacio Jr. and Mother Carmina could not express their joy enough, knowing that their family had been blessed with this new bundle of joy. Atio grew up with a sense of excitement for life. He was full of dreams and aspirations, but above all, he was said to have been kind. He was known to thrive when in service of others. He made time for friends and family despite being busy at school. As a young boy, he had gone through that typical phase when boys learn to tease and be a bit naughty. However, those who have known him during that time in his life and had seen him after that saw how Atio matured and mellowed as he grew older. Atio's parents also described him as God-fearing and affectionate, known to give his parents lots of hugs and kisses. Many loved him and saw a bright future for him. In 2005, that future was nearly extinguished when Atio and his family nearly lost their lives in a fire in Paco, Manila. Little did they know that 12 years later, Atio's future would come under threat again, but this time, there was no way out. On the evening of September 17th, 2017, Carmina and Horacio Castillo Jr. would normally settle in and get ready for a quiet night in before the start of the new work week. But something about this Sunday night was very different. Their son Atio, a freshman law school student at the University of Santo Tomas, or UST, was attending what he called a welcoming party hosted by the Aegis Juris Fraternity, a fraternity based at the UST Faculty of Civil Law. And their son had not yet come back. Carmina and Horacio Jr. Castillo were initially not too keen on the idea of their son joining a fraternity because they knew that a lot of fraternities used hazing when welcoming new members in so-called initiation rites. But Atio reassured them earlier that weekend that hazing was not practiced by the Aegis Juris Fraternity. So they reluctantly said bye to their son on Saturday, September 16th. Atio said he would be back by lunchtime on Sunday, the 17th of September. And when he did not return home and also failed to pick up his mother's calls, the Castillos felt like something was very wrong. And then a text message arrived. It was from someone they did not know. The text message informed them that their son was rushed to the Chinese General Hospital. Without missing a beat, they both hurriedly headed to the hospital, only to be told that the crime scene operatives had actually taken their son to the Archangel Funeral Homes in Sampaloc, Manila. A funeral home? It was like the rug was pulled from under them. What on earth just happened? Carmina and Horacio Jr. and then the world would later learn that at around 7:50 in the morning on the 17th of September, Atio was supposedly found on a pavement at the corner of H. Lopez Boulevard and Infanta Street in Balut Tondo in Manila, unconscious and covered with a blanket. A bystander by the name of John Paul Solano was the one who found Atio. He then claimed that a red Mitsubishi Strada stopped to help him bring Atio to the hospital. At this point, Solano claimed to not have known Atio, and back then there was no reason to doubt him. By 9:21 a.m., Atio was declared dead on arrival at the Chinese General Hospital. From this moment on, things just happened very quickly, with Atio's body being taken to a funeral home by crime scene officers, which clearly indicated that the police were already suspecting foul play. By the time Atio's parents were made aware of their son's death, Atio's body was already being examined, and this was what the police found out so far. Visually, Atio's body was covered with massive bruises on both arms. He sustained injuries from cigarette burns and candle wax dripping, essentially all over his body. The next morning, the police announced that Atio's cause of death was either a cardiac or respiratory arrest due to his severely traumatic injuries. Put together, both the police and the public eventually could see where this was going, and by the time the police were done with their announcement, the word hazing was being floated around. Atio's father was the one who made a statement on the 18th of September that his son was being recruited to join the Aegis Juris Fraternity and that he was heading to a welcome party the night before he was found dead. He firmly made the statement to the media that he believed that Atio died during this fraternity's hazing rites. This set off a media frenzy, with the public remembering past hazing-related deaths and questioning why this practice was still ongoing. Some pointed out the existing law prohibiting hazing, and some were pointing fingers both at the fraternity and the university. Atio's death also came at a time when other young men were being brutally killed in the past administration's war on drugs. It was creating a bit of a fatigue to hear all these young lives lost, one after the other. But there was no time to rest, especially for Atio's family. By the 19th of September, we would learn how the Good Samaritan, John Paul Solano, who supposedly found Atio's body and brought him to the hospital, might not be the stranger he initially made himself to be. As it turned out, Solano was part of the same fraternity that Atio was being initiated to. The Manila Police District therefore announced on this day that they would be inviting Solano in for questioning and that he would have to provide a sworn statement. A mere 24 hours later, the MPD, or Manila Police District, announced that they were interested in 2 more people who turned out to be the same people who were in that red Strada that Solano supposedly flagged down as he was helping Atio to get to the hospital. These 2 individuals were Antonio Tranguilla and his son Ralph, also a member of the Aegis Juris Fraternity. So far, I've mentioned only 3 names, but this list of 3 people of interest would soon grow to 16, and most of them were members of the Aegis Juris Fraternity. From the outside looking in, the developments of the first 48 hours after Atio's death slowly painted a picture of a conspiracy of sorts that went deeper than anyone could see or imagine at that point. The Philippine Senate may have felt the same way and had a vested interest in getting involved, seeing as a law they passed was not sufficient enough to protect Atio from losing his life. On that note, the Senate ordered a probe into Atio's death, whilst the police and immigration authorities made sure that the 16 people of interest were barred from leaving the country. Well, this did not prove to be that effective, since a day later, on the 21st of September, reports emerged that Ralph Tranguilla may have left the country for Taipei, Taiwan. We will circle back to this issue later. Now, by the 22nd of September, John Paul Solano, surprisingly enough, surrendered to Senator Panfilo Lacson, apologizing for giving a false statement by essentially misleading the police. Having said that, he also stated that actually he was never part of the group that hurt Atio. His participation was limited to only providing medical assistance should this be needed during the initiation rites. Of course, people were skeptical because why lie about the fraternity connection in the first place? In any case, Senator Lacson made sure that Solano was turned over to the Manila Police District for further processing. Now, the police and immigration authorities, after having been dealt a blow following Trangia's departure from the country, decided to place 4 more fraternity members on the immigration lookout list. But those 4 people were the least of their problems because the Trangia problem just got worse. According to the Taipei Economic and Cultural Office in the Philippines back then, Trangia was merely a transit passenger and actually never entered Taiwan when he flew from the Philippines. So where was Ralph Trangia headed? According to Taiwanese officials, he flew to Chicago in the US. This was yet another blow to the MPD, and they knew that the media and public scrutiny was going to be harsh and swift. Now, as I said earlier, the Trangia issue would resurface. So for now, let's go back to Solano and the Senate probe that commenced a couple of days after Atio's death. A mere couple of days after Atio's death, this was what the police learned from John Solano. Solano reiterated that he was not present during Atio's initiation rites and he only became involved because his help was needed, seeing as he has some medical background. He said he was at home on Saturday night until Sunday morning when he received a call from his fraternity brothers. He was asked to report to them. Solano then recounted how he first saw Atio's lifeless body in the so-called frat library when he first arrived at the scene. He immediately checked for Atio's pulse and his pupils. He said he performed CPR on Atio, but to no avail. It was at this point that it was decided that Atio needed to be rushed to the hospital. I'm not sure at what point this happened, but Solano also mentioned that a fraternity member had asked him to lie to authorities. I think this may have been at some point after Atio was declared dead on arrival at the hospital. It is clear, however, that at least for one frat member, there was an understanding that Atio's death would cause major problems for the fraternity, and so a supposedly rattled Solano did as he was asked. He lied. Following this statement, Solano was charged with murder, perjury, obstruction of justice, and robbery on the 25th of September 2017. Of course, his lawyers filed a couple of motions to have these charges dismissed. On the same day, murder charges and charges relating to the anti-hazing law of 1995 were also brought against Ralph Trangia and his father Antonio, who was driving the red car that brought Atio to the hospital. The same charges were also brought against 14 other people. 2 days later, it was the 27th of September, and as if in anticipation of something sad, the heavens were covered by some clouds. It was on this day that Atio Castillo was laid to rest, 10 days after he died. The sea of people who attended Atio's burial at the Manila Memorial Park in Parañaque City looked equally sad and enraged. A lot of them wore t-shirts with #Justice for Horacio printed on them. They were demanding justice for their friend, son, nephew, cousin, and classmate. I wonder if at that point they were aware that a mere 24 hours later, their demand for justice would take an even more intense meaning as John Solano was released from police custody on the 28th of September. This meant for the family that no one was being held in custody for their son's death. Now, back at Atio's burial, emotions were raw. Those who loved Atio remembered his short life. They remembered how he wanted to become a lawyer when he actually came from a family full of doctors. They also remembered how he dreamt of becoming a Supreme Court justice. He was merely 2 months into his new life as a law school student when that very big dream was so brutally snatched away. Now, by the time Solano was released, a few more details from this case started to cause some more upset within the Castillo family. For example, it was reported on the 29th of September that the CCTV inside the fraternity library had actually been tampered with, indicating some sort of intention maybe to hide whatever had been going on in that place for however long. There was also a feeling back then that turned out to be a substantiated one. It was felt that senior members of the Aegis Juris Fraternity were essentially helping their younger counterparts and persons of interest in this case essentially elude arrest. One senior member that the media and the Castillo family quickly focused on was the university's Dean of Law, Nilo Divina. As a result of this, Atio's parents filed a supplemental complaint within the Department of Justice in early October 2017 to include Divina in their list of suspects in Atio's death. Divina's response was swift. He filed 2 separate libel complaints against Castillo's lawyers, Lorna Capunan, because he was, of course, not just going to let these grave complaints sit, given the position he had at UST. Divina's libel complaints specified that he had asked for damages totaling 120 million pesos. His libel complaints were a bit odd, though, given that he openly admitted on the 25th of September that he was very much aware of the hazing that was taking place in his own faculty. To quote the Castillos, Respondent Divina positively admitted that he knew that Aegis Juris was practicing hazing. In fact, he even claimed that after his admission to the fraternity, he allegedly proposed the abolition of hazing. End of quote. In any case, the Castillos were not convinced, and they made sure to file complaints for perjury, obstruction of justice, and murder against Divina. The Castillos also made sure to include several other people who were also deemed as being involved or in some way connected to the fraternity and therefore to what happened to Atio. Some of these people were in positions of power, such as the trustees of the Aegis Foundation, which is also located in the fraternity library where the hazing took place. By including these powerful people in their complaint, the Castillos were truly hell-bent on making a whole system responsible for their son's death. This was not just about those who hit Atio with a paddle anymore. This was about a long-standing tradition and system. This was way bigger than UST. It was about a system that had managed to operate almost with impunity, and the Castillos had or have the time, money, and stamina to pursue this in honor of their son, come what may. After this filing of complaints, a total of 37 individuals had been named in connection to Atio's death. This even included Ralph Trangia's mother, Rosemary, who accompanied him to the US in September. Now, apropos Ralph Trangia, and I did say I was going to come back to him, it was around this time as well that the United States Homeland Security stated that they were very much willing to deport Trangia on the request of the Philippine government, but such a request never made it to the desk of whoever dealt with such matters within the U.S. Homeland Security Office, because on the 10th of October 2017, Ralph Trangia returned to the Philippines with his mother. This would have surely provided the investigators of this case with some relief, but they had their work cut out for them because this case very much had not revealed everything yet about itself. It was on the 18th of October 2017 when the police investigators assigned to Atio's case testified that the fraternity members involved in his death made a concerted effort to conceal what happened to him. Screenshots of what looked like a group chat on Facebook were submitted into evidence. These screenshots have been in the public domain for about a month at this point, and they clearly showed how the fraternity brads agreed to adhere to a code of silence and to deactivate their accounts, save for one person. During that same hearing day, a closed-door testimony made previously by John Paul Solano was also released. This testimony was used to establish that a fraternity member by the name of Arvin Balag was the one who urged Solano to lie. As it turned out, Arvin Balag was not just any member. He was actually the fraternity's president at that time. Balag was then questioned, but he refused to answer any of the questions from the senators. As a result, he was held in contempt and then detained. Now, this defiant attitude was not the only one of its kind during the early days of the Senate hearings. On the 22nd of October 2017, John Paul Solano suddenly submitted a counter-affidavit claiming that Atio died, actually, of a pre-existing heart condition and not the hazing. As far as Solano was concerned, Atio died of hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. I personally feel like this was making a mockery of Atio's death, and it would seem like the senators were not happy either that this counter-affidavit was being made. They called it a mockery of justice. In any case, despite this roadblock in the Senate hearing, something big was lurking in the wings that could blow this case wide open, and it came in the form of another fraternity member named Mark Ventura. It was on the 25th of October 2017 when Justice Secretary Aguirre communicated to the Senate probe the admissions made by one Mark Ventura. The Justice Department revealed that Ventura willingly approached them to receive protection as he was willing to reveal more details about Atio's killing, and this is what we learned from him. Ventura claimed that there were a total of 23 individuals who were present at the initiation rites of Atio Castillo. The initiation rites started with a prayer at 2 in the morning. As I understood the reports whilst researching the sequence of events that led to Atio's death, the first part of the rites was all about beating and hitting Atio on his upper arms. The members were told to keep hitting and hitting Atio until his muscles became swollen. After the fraternity members saw the swelling on Atio's arms, they tapped the affected area with a spatula to quote-unquote calm his muscle. At this point, everyone was participating in the hazing. The next part of the rites was the paddling ceremony. It was around 5 a.m. at this point. Ventura said that a karaoke session was held to mask the noise from the initiation rites. Ventura also explained that tradition dictates that a person being initiated was supposed to get 10 paddles, and so Atio was going to get 10 paddles. Atio was hit once, twice, and after the third time, he fell to his knees. He was asked after this if he could still take it. I assume he said yes, as reports indicate that he got back up on his feet only to be hit a fourth and then a fifth time. The fifth hit was exacted by fraternity's president Arvin Balag. After this, Atio collapsed again and was made to sit on a chair. One member made him smell ammonia to wake him up. He remained unconscious. Ventura then said that another member proceeded to check Atio's pulse and talk to him. They got no response. At this point, the atmosphere at the fraternity library shifted. A palpable panic was felt because Atio still remained unconscious. This was around 15 to 20 minutes after he collapsed for the second time. And this is where the story gets even worse, as if it wasn't bad already. Arvin Balag ordered other members of the fraternity to then drop candle wax on Atio's chest and feet to wake him up, but Atio remained unconscious. It was also around this point that John Paul Solano was called up, as the group knew about his medical background. Afterwards, another member, Robin Ramos, suggested bringing Atio to the hospital, but Balag did not like this idea. He hesitated because he did not want to be held and questioned by hospital personnel. The discussion about the hospital continued, and eventually Balag agreed. He left the fraternity library to look for his driver and car. He was followed by Ralph Trangia. Ventura then said that Atio was loaded onto a truck, but for some reason, Balag ordered that Atio's body be brought back to the fraternity library so that another member named Alex Hipe could resuscitate him. In the reports that I've found, it would seem that in the process of Hipe doing this, Atio vomited and showed very minimal response to the light coming from a mobile phone. Some reports stated that his eyes specifically responded to this light. I am assuming, however, that nothing really changed in his general situation, as in, he was largely still unresponsive. At this point, John Paul Solano had arrived and stepped in to perform CPR. He instructed the other members to massage Atio's feet and hands. He then checked Atio's pulse, and this had now dropped to borderline level, meaning it was dangerously close to a rate that would then result in death. Solano then suggested bringing Atio to the hospital, and so finally the group did. Atio was loaded onto the red Strada. Balag decided to tag along convoy style and boarded his own car. Meanwhile, Solano was following them on his motorcycle. After they arrived, Atio was pronounced dead on arrival, and Solano got his story ready to make sure that Atio's death would not be connected to the fraternity, let alone some hazing. This was a bombshell full of details, to the point that even Atio's parents were willing to consider the possibility of dropping charges against Ventura given his very important statement. In any case, Ventura signed a formal acceptance of admission to the Witness Protection Program, and that's how he became a state witness. Now, another state witness was the UST Law Dean Nilo Divina. Yes, he welcomed Ventura's statement and admission, but him becoming a state witness, Divina that is, was not as warmly welcomed as Ventura's. Atio's parents still insisted that Divina knew about the hazing and even attempted to cover up Atio's death in order to protect the younger fraternity members. Of course, Divina was not happy with such accusations. He called such accusations a smear campaign. Meanwhile, Arvin Balag remained defiant, filing a counter affidavit calling for a dismissal of these charges as, according to him, the charges were lacking merit and probable cause. As for Solano, it would seem he was standing by his counter-affidavit, insisting that Atio died of a pre-existing heart condition and not of hazing. These themes would keep on recurring as the Senate continued, paused, and then resumed their probe for the rest of 2017. For example, Divina was criticized for issuing a preventive suspension order for all fraternity members, hindering their entrance into university premises. This then caused them to scatter and abscond, making it harder for the police to track them down. Now, whether this was Divina's intention or not did not even matter during those early stages in the investigation, because the impact of his actions started a sort of chain of events that in one scenario allowed Ralph Trangia to flee to the United States. Personally, I think the most audacious of all these counter-affidavits was Solano's. He was doing so well, finally cooperating with the police. But I'm not sure if his counter-affidavit was motivated by a threat on his life or whether he truly believed in what he was saying. Atio's autopsy showed that, yes, he had a pre-existing heart condition, but the medico-legal report from the crime laboratory office within the PNP also reported that Atio sustained blunt traumatic soft tissue injuries to the right and left upper extremities, his arms. The report indicated clearly that the injuries resulted in a skeletal breakdown, also known as rhabdomyolysis, which can cause electrolyte imbalance and acute kidney injury. The report further explained that Atio's blood work showed an increased level of potassium and a decreased level of calcium, all due to muscle trauma. All of this most likely then caused cardiac failure within Atio, therefore causing his death. Now, earlier I already said that Solano's counter affidavit was a mockery because anyone with a basic level of education can see that even if someone had a pre-existing health condition, such level of trauma like the one Atio sustained could easily hasten the death of any person regardless of their health. You simply cannot omit the role of the thing that hastened the death of someone just because that person was sick beforehand. Solano's counter affidavit almost felt like a red herring, and it is completely ridiculous. I promise I'm gonna stop ranting about this now, so let's go back to the story. This battle by Atio's parents against the system that essentially killed their son continued until the Senate probe was concluded in November 2017. All the evidence heard in the Senate probe was submitted as part of the preliminary investigation into their son's death, and a month before 2017 ended, all parties were ready and waiting for a resolution. The probe was reopened in January 2018, however, when Ventura officially submitted his statement to the investigating parties. This was a bit confusing to me because I thought Ventura had done this bit already, but I do think that when he told the DOJ his version of events, that was then relayed by Secretary Aguirre to the Senate probe, it was not completely official yet. Of course, this all changed in January 2018 when his statement was formally submitted to aid the prosecution in making their case against the current list of suspects. Of course, the suspects and their lawyers were not happy with the reopening of the Senate probe and made sure to file motions to stop it. However, as I understand it, the probe needed to take place to allow the suspects to file counter affidavits as a response to Ventura's statement. On the 24th of January 2018, a 46-page report by the Senate Committees on Public Order and Dangerous Drugs and Justice and Human Rights concluded that Atio Castillo died of hazing. The committees also recommended the disbarment of UST Law Dean Nilo Divina and at least 18 other lawyers for failing to report Atio's death despite being aware of it and the hazing. 24 hours later, calls for Divina to resign became louder and louder, but he still refused, saying that if he resigned, it would be an injustice towards his students. Right. Now, with the committee's report done, the ball was now in the court of the Justice Department. They were reviewing all the evidence that was uncovered and submitted during the Senate probe, and they surely had their hands full. Despite initial fears that the DOJ would take ages to finally file criminal charges, they actually came through this time. In early March 2018, the Justice Department formally charged 10 Aegis Juris Fraternity members with the murder of Atio Castillo. In a 46-page resolution, the DOJ panel of prosecutors found probable cause to indict the following frat members: Arvin Balag, Ralph Tranguilla, Oliver John Audrey Onofre, Minwei Chan, Axel Monroe Hipe, Daniel Hans Matthew Rodrigo, Joshua Juriel Macabali, Marcelino Bagtang, Jose Miguel Salamat, and Robin Ramos for violating the Republic Act 8049 or Anti-Hazing Law of 1995. John Paul Solano was also charged on this day, but with perjury. As far as I know at this point, none of these men were actually being detained. An order to finally arrest and then detain them came later on the 22nd of March. Not wanting to probably make this harder than it already was, the men surrendered to the NBI, or National Bureau of Investigation, and were then taken to custody. 2 months later, they would find themselves turned over to the custody of the Manila City Jail. You probably would not be surprised to learn that it took a few more months to arraign these men, and when they were arraigned, they all pleaded not guilty. Now, when the trial started, it was clear that the prosecution would place a lot of stock into Mark Ventura's testimony. Ventura, who probably just went into self-preservation mode when he decided to essentially turn against his brods, was very emotional when he finally took the stand at the trial. And this is what I sometimes find myself coming back to. These are men, sure, but young men, really. I'm not infantilizing them or trying to absolve them of any wrongdoing by citing their age, but who in their right mind really thought it was a good idea to introduce a tradition into the midst of a bunch of young men without any supervision from older men or people, without real oversight by the university, and cement into that tradition that the only way to be welcomed into the fold was to allow people to hit you until you bleed, vomit, collapse, or die. I know I am veering off my usual script flow here, but Atio's death was so senseless. It is my argument that hazing, and by virtue all fraternities and sororities with violent practices, have no place in modern Philippines. Fraternities and sororities are an import to our country by the US and therefore a product of colonialism. It was openly welcomed, sadly, by those before us because it helped reinforce a sense of exclusivity and, most importantly, oppressive structures that benefited those already with economic, political, and social power. The only reason fraternities and sororities survive to this very day is that people who partake in them believe that they will have a slice of that power pie. After all, who does not like power? Especially in a country where the powerful seem untouchable. And sure, those who have joined some of the more powerful fraternities have seen themselves favored in some spaces, but at what cost to themselves and to the others outside of those fraternities? Atio's case is still ongoing. We have seen testimonies, bail applications, motions being filed left and right, bail refusals, and even a temporary release application when COVID was at its height. Despite everything we have heard about Ventura's testimony, despite everything we have heard about Atio's autopsy, despite there being a law that bans anti-hazing and now an amended version of it, the Castillos are still waiting for justice to be served. In November 2022, the Court of Appeals barred the presentation of some of the prosecution's most vital evidence against the defendants, potentially weakening the case in general. The only person so far convicted was Solano, who was found guilty of obstruction of justice. He was not even found guilty of perjury. In simple terms, he was not found guilty for lying to authorities, and that is disheartening. Disheartening is also the fact that as I am typing and recording this episode, news just broke that Atio's case essentially has been sent back to the trial court where it all began. There are still no murder or hazing-related convictions in this case, nothing that can tangibly show that this case has finally come to an end. Instead, the Castillos are starting from zero. But as Atio's case is on the way to being reheard a whole 6 years after his death, another life was yet again claimed by hazing, and people are asking this time, will it ever end? On the 18th of February 2023, Adamson University student John Matthew Salilig was reported missing, having last been seen at the Jackliner Buendia bus terminal in Manila at around 10:26 that morning. By the 23rd of that month, the Adamson University student government had posted a plea for help. They've asked people to help find the missing chemical engineering student. The post then went viral. According to that post, John Matthew, also known to friends and family as Matmat, was wearing his university uniform under a red Puma hoodie. It would seem that he was in contact with loved ones until his phone died after it ran out of battery, after which all communication ceased. The post explained that a police report had been filed already. 5 days after this post was made public and 10 days after the last time Matmat was seen, his badly beaten body was found on a vacant lot in Imos, Cavite. He was so badly beaten that he was almost unrecognizable. The police were swift to make a connection between Matmat and the Tau Gamma Phi fraternity through interviewing witnesses and piecing together Matmat's movements as shown on CCTV. Now, I will not go into Matmat's case in detail right now, as I am waiting to see how the case unfolds for at least another 2 to 3 months before I cover it on this podcast. But I just want to convey how badly Matmat was failed by the system that supposedly had learned from Atio's case. In 2018, an amended anti-hazing law was passed. This was spearheaded by Miguel Zubiri, who is a personal friend of the Castillos, and who made sure that this law was dedicated to Atio. And yet, the system has got another body and its blood on their hands. Matmat, together with 2 other neophytes, sustained 70 blows to their bodies from 1:30 until 3:30 in the afternoon. Matmat at some point experienced stomach pain and then soiled himself, after which he turned pale and started vomiting. Matmat withstood the paddling and joined the group as they traveled back to the capital from Binyan, Laguna, but not before he vomited yet again. It was 7 in the evening at this point. As the group reached Parañaque, Matmat suffered a seizure and never regained consciousness despite efforts to revive him. The group, instead of rushing him to a hospital so that he could receive medical care, kept his now dead body overnight and disposed of him later. They left him in a shallow grave as his body started to fully show the severity of the beatings. His skin had turned almost completely purple. I ask now, where is the brotherhood in this? As Matmat's family was left to wonder what had happened to him, his supposed frat brothers went on with their lives as if nothing happened, feeling justified in their choice of having left the decomposing body of their frat broad naked and exposed and buried haphazardly on some vacant lot. As of March 7th, the Senate Justice and Human Rights Committee had launched an investigation into Matmat's death. How many months will this one last? How many months will it take for the DOJ to then file charges? How many months will the trial last? And how many years will Matmat's family have to wait for justice? Unless something more drastic happens than these streamed Senate probes or vague think pieces on fraternities or defiant universities who seem unable and unwilling to take responsibility for their part in this tradition of fraternities and sororities, the list of families waiting to see justice served will grow longer and longer each year. And we will continue to lose young men whose lives could have made a difference in our society had they not been so brutally cut short. Lagim fam, thank you for listening to another episode of Lagim, and I apologize for peppering this episode with lots of my own opinions on the subject. I'm simply baffled and outraged by such senseless deaths of such young people. But before I go into another rant, I do want to thank you again for listening and for patiently waiting for this Holy Week episode. I hope you found this episode valuable and or interesting. If you did, make sure to rate and review my podcast on Apple and Spotify because it does help with making my podcast more visible to those who do not know about it yet. Also, tell your mom about it, or maybe your uncle, or your sisters and brothers. Also, make sure to follow me on all my socials. Check the show notes for all the links to my Insta, Twitter, TikTok, and Facebook accounts. Until next episode, thank you Lagim fam, maraming salamat, at mabuhay.